Hello, thank you for joining me today. So today we're going to be making a floral card using metallic watercolors. So to get started, I'm just going to drop some clean water into the colors that I know that I'm going to use, just to kind of loosen up the pigment to make them a little bit easier to work with when it's time to get started. Since I am very much a rookie when it comes to watercolors, I'm going to cheat a little bit by using embossing, because the raised edges of the embossing powder will kind of help control the paint and where it goes. And since this is cold pressed watercolor paper, I'm going to use my Misty stamping tool so I can stamp the image multiple times in the exact same place so I get a very good impression. And since I do plan on embossing, I'm going to use my anti-static powder bag to assist with not having a lot of stray embossing powder sticking to the paper when it's time to melt it. I'm inking up my stamp with Versamark watermark ink, which is just a sticky ink which will give the embossing powder something to stick to before I use a heat tool to melt it. Okay, once it looks like we have a good impression on the paper, I'm going to pull out platinum embossing powder from Alta New as well as a coffee filter to catch all the excess pour over powder. So it looks like the anti-static powder tool did a really good job, and the excess embossing powder seems to be releasing very well from the watercolor paper, but I do always tap the back of the card or the paper just to make sure that any excess falls off before it's time to heat it. I do try to let my heat tool warm up for a moment before I actually aim it at my project, because if the tool is already hot, then you get a lot less warping because you spend less time applying heat to the paper, and that kind of just makes it easier to work with overall. And as any pet owner will tell you, no matter how careful you are, a stray dog hair will find its way to your project. And once all the embossing powder is nice and melted and it's already set, I just use a microfiber cloth to kind of wipe away a lot of the excess powder that's still on the paper. So this is a cutting board that I actually got from a thrift store for pretty cheap, and I use it to tape down my papers whenever I'm going to be using wet media and I don't want my paper to warp. I will say this paper is pretty soft, so be careful with where you're applying your tape, because wherever you apply tape, it is going to tear slightly. And this is about the time when I remember that I am left-handed, so I should probably have my watercolors on my left side as opposed to my right, so I kind of have to reshuffle my entire setup for a moment. And as I start actually putting paint to the paper, I start questioning why I thought that this was something that was within my realm of abilities, and why I've watched so many Christina Werner videos that have convinced me that I know how to watercolor, but I've committed. I am here now. So I kind of just keep adding a little bit of water so that the black of the paper shows through a little bit to kind of get a color variation so that the color isn't completely flat on the paper. And as I work my way through a rough approximation of a rainbow, I kind of fell out of my head a little bit and just enjoyed the process of putting in a little bit more paint or a little bit more water and kind of moving the colors around into shapes that start to resemble petals and then start to resemble flowers. And it gets a little bit easier and I get a better idea of what I'm doing. I'm still nowhere near what one would call a watercolorist, but I did end up enjoying the process. And I didn't really want to make a green bloom, but flowers have leaves, leaves are green, so I felt like that would be a good way to both tie these little islands of colors together as well as putting in the green to sort of complete the whole rainbow vibe. And for the small berry shaped areas of the image, I used two different metallic jelly roll pens and kind of just tapped the color into place rather than try to actually draw or use a typical coloring motion. Just because I felt like I would have a little bit more control with the jelly roll pens than I would with my brush. And now we can put this aside to dry and work on building out the sentiment for the front of the card. So we're going to bring the Misty back out, this time with the foam insert inside of it, since we're going to be using a clear stamp and not a rubber stamp. And this is one of the sentiments from the Altenew Mega Greetings 3 stamp set, since we're going to also be using the Mega Love die that matches the stamp set as well. And we're doing all the familiar steps as far as embossing, just repeating what we did earlier with the background stamp, just on a slightly smaller scale. And this time we're going to be using rose gold embossing powder from Simon Says Stamp. And I am pretty bad at trimming down sentiment strips evenly, so I'm just going to be using a sentiment strip label die that's also from Simon Says Stamp, just so I don't have to worry about things being even on all sides. And so now that everything is die cut, I'm just going to kind of move things around and play with placement until I have a good idea of where I want things to go. And once I do, I'm going to glue the 2 layers together that I die cut using the Mega Love die from Altenew that I mentioned earlier. And I'll just slightly offset the shimmery top layer from the black backing layer, just so that there is a good separation of the shimmery Love cardstock from the background. And right before I glue everything down, I decided that I really want to add a little bit of dimension to this card. So I put a few small foam squares on the back of the Love die to pop it up from the background. And then I add the same foam squares on the back of the strip, and that way the entire sentiment is the same height. And then we'll just add a spot of glue underneath that V just to make sure that the whole thing is a little bit more secure. And this is where I thought I was going to end the card, but I really felt like it needed a border. So I used the same shimmery cardstock that I die cut the Love out of to mat the card to put a 1/4 inch border on all sides of it, which brings the card to a total size of 6 inches square. And with that, that will complete the card, and I will leave you with some of the final pictures. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again. Bye-bye.